Welcome everyone. This week we are going to be discussing the Botvinnik System, which is an easy to learn opening for white. If you're a busy adult with limited study time, and let's face it, that's most of us, you may want to check this out. That's coming up, so stick around. So I'm going to divide this episode into two main parts. First, I'm going to discuss system openings and what they are in the general sense, and then we'll get into the Botvinnik system. So what exactly is a system opening? I know many of you may know that, but we do have a lot of beginners and advanced beginners that range listening to this podcast, so I just want to go through it from the beginning, give a thorough definition, just so we're all on the same page. So a system opening is an opening where the goal is achieving a certain formation or a certain structure. In other words, you want certain pieces to end up on certain squares, and the move order is generally not always that vital, as opposed to some openings that are very move order dependent. So with a system opening, you want to achieve a certain structure. And the main thing about system openings is that they work against pretty much anything your opponent can throw at you. As an example, we've discussed the London system. Everyone's heard of it. You know, I play it. I'm not going to get into it now. As a side note, if you do want to hear more about the London system, you can check out episode 37 of this podcast. I'll put a link for it in the show description. That was a dedicated episode just on the London system. And the reason I advocate system openings for at least some of your opening repertoire is that they're great for busy adults with limited study time, which, as I said in the intro, that's probably most of us. And you can focus on other aspects of your game that likely need attention, such as basic endgames, tactics, calculation, things like that. And in addition to being easy to learn, these system openings are actually very, very good. Some people may think, well, if it's that simple and if you're just achieving a structure and if it's that easy to learn, how good can they really be? But they are very, very good. We'll talk about that in a minute and some of the players who use these systems. But what I want to do now is I want to give a personal example of my own life and my own schedule. I'm guessing many of you can relate to this. And it's a large reason why I adopted using system openings, particularly the London system for me. So as you know, I run the Long Island Chess Club. Like most of you, I have a day job. And what happens is after work, like many of you, it's helping around the house. It's help with homework, dinner, things like that. Maybe I need to pay a few bills. Maybe there's something I need in the house to pay attention to, something with family, that type of thing. And basically, I'm barely making it out of the house to get to the club. Then when I do get there, right, I have to set up, turn the lights on, open up my laptop, deal with any texts or phone calls or messages, any last minute buys. I have to do the pairings, make the announcements, and then boom, at the drop of a hat, I have to play my game. So for me, there's no downtime, no type of warm-up. I just have to literally flip a switch and play my game. Now, when I say that, I'm not giving a poor me speech or complaining in any way, shape, or form. That's just how it is. And when you have these system openings to rely on, it really helps if you're in a situation where you have that kind of schedule and you can't kind of ease into the game. So sure, ideally, if you know you're playing a tournament game in the evening, you would want to come home from work, maybe relax, take a nap, review some openings, maybe do one or two tactical puzzles, maybe play a few games online, something like that, kind of ease into it, get to the club early, kind of just sit there, breathe a little bit, clear your mind. That's all, I'm laughing. That's all well and good, but that's not going to happen for me. And think about how that changes the game for you. I basically have to use the opening of the game itself to kind of settle down and warm up, when ideally you should be in that position before you start. But the beauty about system openings is that I don't have to worry if that week I didn't spend a lot of time on opening preparation. I don't really have to worry about what my opponent is playing because these openings work against anything he can throw at me. And as a result, I have confidence in the opening. I don't have to worry, oh, I didn't study this or I didn't study that. So when titled players or even non-titled players sort of bust on these system openings, which, by the way, I'm going to debunk a lot of the criticism of system openings in a moment. But when they criticize that, they don't realize the situation that a lot of us are in. We're not in the same situation as maybe a chess professional where, they don't have a conventional day job and, we just kind of have to jump in and play. Think about if you're an athlete. If you're a basketball player, let's say, I'm just using basketball off the top of my head, how would you do well in a game? What you need to do is you would have to get to the court early, warm up, stretch, take some shots, that type of thing. But picture having to play basketball after coming home from work, helping with dinner, helping with homework, doing things around the house, and then you're rushing there in your work clothes, you change real quick and boom, you're playing. No warm up, no nothing. How do you think you're going to do? How much harder is it going to be compared to someone who has warmed up? I mean, think about that. And then one of the things that used to bother me, not so much at the club anymore, I mean, once in a while, but the thing is, sometimes you'll get players at the club where, for whatever reason, they're in a situation where they are sort of properly prepared mentally, meaning, for a fact that they kind of relaxed before the club. They played a few blitz games. They've been studying all week. And I used to sit across from these players and be like, how can I compete with this? I'm pretty much just flipping a switch and jumping right in. And yet this guy probably was like studying all day or something, or played some blitz games and he's like all warmed up and ready. How do I compete with that? But now I don't think about that anymore. I just play my game. And because I have these openings, I know that I'll do okay and that I'll kind of ease into it. So if you're relying on an opening that's very theoretical and you constantly need to stay on top of it in order to play well, that's going to be tough to do long term if you're in a situation where you're kind of coming straight from work or straight from home after being busy with other things. Now, I want to make a comment about playing E4 as white, because a lot of these system openings stem from D4, playing one D4, or as we'll see in a moment with the Botvinnik formation, one C4. The thing is with one E4, and this is something I've always felt strongly about. Danny Wrench mentions this in the YouTube video that I linked up. He says it really well, and I'm going to mention it here also. With E4, you're kind of letting black call the shots, if you think about it. Because if you play E4 as white, he can choose the Sicilian, which is a whole thing. He can choose the Caro-Kann. He can choose the Pierce. He can choose the French. He can choose the center counter defense. Like, there are so many different things that black can play. So after E4, you have to be well versed in all of these different directions that black can go in, as opposed to playing a system opening where you can do the same structure regardless of what black plays. Just something to think about. And another thing, this has to do with the psychological aspect of the game, which is huge. Many players, some would argue most players, hate facing these system openings. So that psychological fact alone will often give you an advantage. I'm going to give you a little tip. There's a way to annoy your opponent and throw him off and get him upset and mess with his head and get him frustrated with just one move. Like, how is that possible? I'm telling you, one move and it's going to drive your opponent crazy. You ready? If you have the white pieces, just open with either D4 or C4, and it's going to drive your opponent crazy. Think about that for a minute. Think about how many times, maybe yourself, and I can just tell from having done this for so long, you play D4, most players freak out. It's like, oh, D4, here we go again, these D pawn openings. If you play C4, it's the same thing. Oh, C4, this English, like it really drives people crazy. And I feel like they're more prepared for E4. Now, just as a little teaser, next week's episode, I didn't record it yet, but I have it outlined, is going to be about that. It's going to be how you can stop fearing 1d4. When you play black, if you have the black pieces and your opponent opens with d4, I'm going to share some thoughts on how to handle that so that you stop freaking out about it, and so that facing 1d4 is not this hole or leak in your game, like this no man's land that you can't seem to fix. That'll be next week. But anyway, if you open as white with 1d4 or 1c4, for most amateurs, that's going to drive them nuts. Just a little rabbit hole I wanted to go down there. Now let's debunk some criticism of system openings, because there's a lot of that out there. I think most of it is false. Most of it is misguided. And here we go. Let's take these one at a time. So the first criticism of system openings is that they say players go on autopilot and they don't think critically. And here's the issue with that. That can happen for any opening. You could play the Roy Lopez and go on autopilot and not think critically. You could play the Najdorf Sicilian and go on autopilot and not think critically. This can happen for all openings. I could argue that it's even worse for theoretical openings because you're just obsessed with what the next move should be, and then your opponent makes a slight adjustment, you don't realize it, but you play whatever, bishop g5, because that's what normally comes on move 4 or whatever it is. And you hear, even with grandmasters, this happens all the time. I mean, I remember reading with a number of mainstream openings where there was an annotation where something like, oh, this person went on autopilot here, even though they didn't realize, their opponent did this, something like that. I forget the language, but you get the idea. So the whole idea of going on autopilot and not really thinking, that can happen with any opening. It's the player. It's not the opening. That's the player. That's a player thing. That's a mindset thing. Like, I play the London. I don't go on autopilot. I can play it against any opening, but I don't go on autopilot. I still think. I take my time. Now, the astute listener might say, well, Neil, you just contradicted yourself because you said you use these system openings because of your schedule and you're like rushing to the club and then you sit down and play and it works for you. No. I don't mean that I go on autopilot. I just mean it works with my busy schedule because I can use it against anything that black throws at me. I don't have to worry about like preparing for an opponent. If I go into my London system, or if I played like the Botvinnik formation, let's say, any type of system opening is white, I'm saying it works not because I'm going on autopilot and not thinking, because it works against anything black throws at me. I don't have to say, oh, well, black's doing this tonight and I didn't prepare for that. That doesn't come into play when you use these system openings. Okay, so it's not about going on autopilot. The second criticism of system openings is that they limit your development as a player. Oh, I love this one. They limit your development as a player because you're not exposing yourself to different pawn structures and positions. Not really true, because I know my system opening games go in a lot of different directions, have a lot of different structures. Now, I'll concede, I'm trying to be fair here. I'll concede maybe to a certain degree that might be true, maybe to a certain extent, but that criticism is really overblown. And isn't the point of opening study to understand the structures that you're going to see on a regular basis so that you know what to do? That's the whole point of opening study. So you could say, even if you study the Sicilian or the Roy Lopez, you're still going to see similar pawn structures in those openings. So again, this is one of those arguments that can be applied to any opening, not just system openings. But the idea that it's going to limit your development as a player, that's utter nonsense. And most players at this level anyway, that's not really an issue. It's more about limiting blunders and tactics and calculation. So I'm not buying that for a second. That's completely overblown. And the third criticism of system openings that's out there is that they are only for beginners, right? Because we call them system openings. That somehow has a patronizing or pejorative term to it. Oh, it's a system opening. He's not a real chess player. He plays a system opening. Don't tell anybody. No, not at all. They're not just for beginners. Now, here's the thing. People say they're for beginners. They get that stereotype because of the fact that they're pretty easy to learn. and there's not as much theory. They're not as move order dependent. So because it's kind of easy to learn, we assume, well, that means that it's also for beginners. Not true. I could give a ton of examples, but real quick, Magnus, Carlsen, Gadakamsky, they play the London, and Magnus plays the London a lot. I mean, that's like a big thing for him. Yasser Seirawan plays the Botvinnik structure. Karpov and Kasparov have played it as well. That's just a few examples, and those are some of the most famous GMs ever. So the idea that these openings are just for beginners is utter nonsense. So those are my thoughts on system openings in general, why I feel they're good for amateur players, and I believe I addressed a lot of the criticism of system openings, which I don't agree with. That being said, let's talk about the Botvinnik system. The Botvinnik structure or the Botvinnik system, whatever you want to call it, tomato, tomato, potato. Anyway, it is an offshoot of the English opening. So this is a 1C4 opening. Now, you could call it a variation of the English, but I don't like using the term variation because it implies that there's a lot of theory and specific move orders. I like to think of it as a system that stems from the English 1C4. I'm kind of parsing here. I guess it really doesn't matter. But anyway, this Botvinnik formation, of course, popularized by Mikhail Botvinnik, the great Russian grandmaster, 6th world chess champion. And this formation can be used against pretty much anything black throws at you. Now, let me say this. I did put a number of things in the show description. There is a PGN, very basic PGN of the basic lines, so you can take a look at it. I linked up a chess.com article from Jeremy Silman that explains this very well. I linked up a video by I Am Danny Wrench, about a 6-minute video, very, very good explanation. I also linked up a YouTube video from I Am Valery Lilov, and I also linked the episode that I did on the London system, where I also talk about system openings in general. That was episode 37. So all of these are referenced in the show notes. So let's talk about the main structure of the Botvinnik formation. Now remember, the opening move is 1C4. So let's talk about that. Let's kind of go back a little bit. Why does white play 1C4? Because usually it's like 1E4 or 1D4, play in the center. With 1C4, it's kind of a flank opening. And let's think about what's happening. White is fighting for control of the D5 square. And remember, when you develop your pieces, they should be developed with a goal in mind. Development doesn't mean simply getting your pieces off their original squares. They need to get off their original squares with a goal in mind and work in a coordinated fashion. So after 1C4, right, that C4 pawn controls D5. It also controls B5, but for the purposes of development, we're not worried about B5 right now. We're looking at D5. So think, how else can you add to the control of D5? By playing E4 and by playing G3 and then fianchettoing with bishop G2. That's a major idea in the English generally and in this system. So think about it. You have a pawn on C4, a knight on C3, and a bishop on G2, and a pawn on E4. That all hits the D5 square, right? So you're looking for that central control. So we have the pawn on C4, a knight on C3, another knight on E2, your dark squared bishop on E3, and then your pawn on G3, your bishop on G2. White will generally castle, and your D pawn is on D3. So I call this kind of the reverse triangle. Like the typical triangle formation in the London is your pawns are on D4, C3, and E3. In this case, it's kind of a backwards triangle. Your pawns are on C4, D3, and E4. So the one little drawback you have to watch out for is that you have that hole on D4, which black can take advantage of, but that's why we have the knight on E2 to control that. And in most lines, black probably will sink a knight into D4. Now, before I continue, a couple of sort of disclaimers that I forgot to mention in the beginning. I'm giving you sort of a dictionary entry version of this opening. This is very basic. I'm not looking at every line, every nook and cranny, every possible example and nuance. I'm just giving you a basic idea. This is not a lifetime repertoire on the Botvinnik system. And even the references and the links that I included, that's just to get you started. There's plenty of other stuff out there if you really want to do a deep dive into it. I'm just giving you the basic structure and the basic ideas. So again, the formation is pawns on C4, D3, and E4. Our knights are on C3 and E2. We castle kingside. Our dark squared bishop is on E3, and we fianchetto the kingside bishop. So we have a pawn on G3 and a bishop on G2. Couple of things to keep in mind. The reason that we go knight to E2, the reason we don't go knight F3 is because we don't want to block the bishop's control, the light squared bishop's control of E4. And as I'll talk about in a minute, you don't want to block the F pawn because that is a thematic push. The other reason the knight goes on E2 is so that you can control D4, which is a little bit of a weakness. That's the one drawback. But remember, you can't stop everything. My old coach, Danny Kopak, used to say that, you can't stop everything. And you'll notice, as with the London, it's really about central control. Let's talk about some themes and ideas here. And I'm going to contrast it to the London just to show you the difference, to kind of give us a basis of comparison. With the London system, it's really about central control, not central expansion. You have that fortress in the center, and then what happens often, and this is the case when you have control of the center, you attack on the wing. So very often in the London, especially if you play it aggressively, you're going to go for a kingside attack because you have your bishop on D3. You're going to maybe do H4, and there are all sorts of attacks on the king side. However, you can also play the London very positionally, and you can go for queenside play. You can look for play down the C file. You can go for the slow squeeze. I'm speaking very, very broadly right now, but there are different ways to do it. With the Botvinnik formation, there are two main ways to play. You kind of have two choices. One is queenside expansion with B2 to B4, playing for that pawn lever. Or you can expand on the king side by going F2 to F4. That's why we didn't put the knight on F3. Okay, so the B2, B4 idea, expanding on the queen side, or the F2, F4 idea for kingside play, those are sort of your ideas. That's what you're playing for. How do we get to this structure? Let's try to go through it. We have C4, C5, symmetrical opening there, knight C3, knight C6, G3, G6, bishop G2, bishop G7, E4, knight F6, knight G to E2, black castles, white castles, and then black goes D6. White then goes E3, forming that triangle. And then an idea that black has here is actually to go knight E8, which is actually strong because then he can push with F5. I don't want to get too carried away, but that's the gist of the opening. All right, so again, white's pawns are on C4, D3, and E4. The bishop is on G2. It's fianchettoed. White's knights are on C3 and E2. The dark squared bishop is going to go to E3 generally. And white's two ideas, his two options, are queenside expansion with B2, B4, or kingside expansion with F2, F4. Those are the ideas, right? You probably have to get your rook to B1, that type of thing. You have to set it up. But those are the ideas. And this structure after 1c4 can be played against virtually anything black throws at you. So that'll do it for this week. Some ideas about system openings in general. And we took a look at the Botvinnik formation, which is based off of 1c4. Just the basic idea, the basic structure. You can check out the links in the show notes and research this on your own. It may be something that you might want to use when you have the white pieces. A little bit of a shorter episode this week, but that's okay. That's kind of nice once in a while. We all have things to do. I know I have to do some Christmas shopping now. It's that time of year. But anyway, we really appreciate you listening. As always, a reminder, next week's episode is going to be about facing D4, specifically things you can do, things you can think about, and things you can sort of prepare so that you don't freak out about it. It's going to be more of a mindset type of thing and some ideas and some things that players need to do that they're not doing. It's not going to be me telling everybody to play the Nimzo and Queen's Indian, in case that's what you were thinking. That is how I handle D4. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. That's part of it, but that's not going to be the answer. It's not going to be an episode that just says, okay, you want to deal with D4? Just play the Nimzo and Queen's Indian and you're set for life. I'm going to mention that tangentially, but that's not really what it's going to be about. It's some things to think about, because I know for myself, I struggled against 1D4 for a long time. We'll get into that next week, but just a little sneak preview as far as what I'm going to be talking about. That should be an interesting discussion, and of course it's going to be specifically geared towards the issues that amateur and club level players face that stronger players and GMs may not deal with. So kind of a different ecosystem there. Really appreciate you listening. And as always, I hope you win your next game. Have a great day, everybody.